Hi, I'm Miranda Way, graduate student at the University of Washington. Today, I'm presenting work done with my co-authors at the University of Chicago, University of Maryland, and University of Southampton. The title of our work is What Twitter Knows: Characterizing Ad Targeting Practices, User Perceptions, and Ad Explanations Through Users' Own Twitter Data. Many online companies offer targeted advertising, which allows advertisers to use detailed information about users' demographics, preferences, and more to target ads. What comes to mind first might be targeting by gender, location, or general interests. But social media companies collect much more detailed information, like how you interact with platform posts or other users. So in reality, ad targeting criteria are creepily specific. This is an ad that was shown to me on Twitter in September of 2018 from Heinz Ketchup about their Heinz Fantasy Sandwich campaign. This ad was targeted to me because I matched 16 criteria set by Heinz, including being on their list of organic and natural ketchup buyers, as well as apparently interacting with #parenting on Twitter. I was able to learn this information because of GDPR and similar data regulations. Through the data access requests as required by these laws, Twitter offers detailed targeting information for the ads that their users see. We used this data to conduct a study that measured targeted advertising on Twitter, as well as user perceptions and preferences of that targeting. We asked two main research questions. First, what are the discrete targeting mechanisms offered to advertisers on Twitter, and how are they used to target Twitter users? In other words, we used participants' Twitter data to measure how advertisers are targeting ads on Twitter. Second, what do Twitter users think of these practices and the existing transparency mechanisms? To that end, we conducted a user study based on each participant's own Twitter data. For Part A, we investigate perceptions of comfort and fairness. For Part B, we study ad explanations, which are meant to help users understand how an ad was chosen for them. For our study, we first recruited participants from the prolific crowdsourcing platform to request their Twitter data. We then invited them back a few days later when they had received their Twitter data. We automatically extracted and uploaded only 3 Twitter files that were related to advertising. We parsed the data to create customized surveys about targeting types found in their files, as well as their opinions of ad explanations. So now I'll start with the first research question. What ad targeting mechanisms exist on Twitter, and how are they used to target users? We received valid data from 231 participants for this study. The average person had spent 6.6 years on Twitter and saw over 1,000 ads in the last 3 months. Across all our participants, we collected over 240,000 ads that used at least one targeting type. An example of a targeting type is targeting by location. We also observed over 45,000 different instances of targeting, indicating a huge diversity of instances used by advertisers to target ads. For example, Boston is just one instance of location targeting. Through our analysis of users' Twitter advertising data, we found 30 specific targeting mechanisms that we categorize into 3 groups. The first is demographic targeting, characteristics about users and their devices, either provided by the user or inferred by Twitter. Ads can be targeted on 0 or more targeting types. We saw language targeting used over 350,000 times across 240,000 ads, which means on average, ads used more than one instance of language targeting. Platform and location were also frequently used. But others were less well known, like targeting based on whether you're using a new device, which is something that's inferred by Twitter. The second is psychographic, users' lifestyles, behaviors, or attitudes as provided by users or inferred by Twitter. The more well-studied in the academic literature are behavior and interest targeting, which were used tens of thousands of times in our data. But we found others that were used more than these commonly studied types. For example, follower lookalikes allows advertisers to target people who are similar to followers of an account, even if they don't follow that account. Conversation targeting targets users based on conversations they've engaged with on Twitter. Finally, the third is advertiser provided, which uses information that advertisers collected about users off of Twitter. These targeting types can be very opaque to users. For example, tailored lists, which use lists of users as determined and uploaded by the advertiser. Mobile targeting lets advertisers to target users of their own mobile apps, and tailored web lets advertisers target people that have previously visited their website. Twitter has advertising policies that prohibit targeting by sensitive or legal categories. Yet, in going through our data, we came across a few potential violations. We observed targeting to keywords like unemployment, gay, #African American, and Latinas. We also observed targeting to those that had engaged in conversations about Liberal Democrats, a UK political party. Some names of tailored list targeting also suggested violations, such as account status balance due, Christian audience to exclude, and LGBT suppression list. These names are selected by advertisers for their own reference. Advertisers can upload lists of user identifiers like Twitter handles to specify the users they want to target. Although these potential violations were overall in the minority, these are just some examples of targeting that could be perceived as sensitive. I'll return to the implications of finding potential violations at the end of this talk. Now I'll talk about part A of the second research question. What were our participants' thoughts about ad targeting? Our user study elicited participants' opinions about ad targeting. Crucially, these survey questions asked about ways the user had actually been targeted, according to their Twitter data. We asked about the use of targeting types generally, such as targeting based on events, as well as the use of specific instances, such as the 2019 Women's World Cup. Participants tended to be okay with the general, but less so with specific instances. Only 25% of participants did not want to see ads that used event targeting. However, when participants saw a specific event they were targeted on, 65% did not want to be targeted. When participants agreed that an instance of targeting was accurate, they were significantly more likely to agree it was fair and be comfortable with it. Overall, accuracy was highly correlated with many other perceptions, but this doesn't justify collecting more data to increase accuracy at the cost of privacy. Our free text responses indicated an upper bound where increasing accuracy is no longer comfortable. Now I'll talk about part 2B, regarding transparency of how a particular ad was chosen for a particular user. Specifically, we compared 6 ad explanations. For each, we selected a Twitter ad that the participant actually saw, and the explanation used their Twitter data to show how that ad had been targeted to them. The first 2 were current ad explanations. Twitter's is pretty simple and shows at most 3 targeting criteria of any ad, even if there were more than 3. Facebook's includes a timeline to show when advertisers may have uploaded information used to target this ad. We then tested some speculative ad explanations, which we created to let users have a much more comprehensive look at how ads were targeted to them. We created detailed text and detailed visual, which showed instances that were used and explored different visual layouts. We also created an explanation to probe the upper bound of information to include, which we dubbed the creepy ad explanation. Given prior work, we expected an ad explanation that explained all of the nitty-gritty details to be perceived as creepy. And finally, we compared all of these to a control that provided no meaningful information about how the ad was targeted. Participants were shown these explanations in random order and weren't told where they were from. Comparing the ad explanations, we found that participants valued having more information about how ads were targeted. These bar charts show the percentage of participants that strongly agreed that an explanation was useful and whether they would want to see similar explanations in the future. Control was the least useful, followed by Facebook and Twitter. Participants rated our 3 speculative ad explanations the most useful. In our qualitative responses, we found that participants perceived ambiguity to mean information was missing or intentionally omitted, which may explain why they preferred our more detailed explanations. In conclusion, I have 4 key takeaways. First, advertising transparency is extremely important. GDPR's right to data access was the only way we were able to do this study, And there's still more transparency to be had, given that it took us months to obtain clarifications needed to understand the ad data, which was presented as a JSON dump. Part of our study relied on understanding a data field named matched targeting criteria, and whether this meant all criteria had actually been matched to the user. After 4 months, they clarified that yes, it does. We sent our request twice, first to Twitter support and then to the data protection officer. The first time, we just received links to help pages. And the second time, the data protection officer said they would be using a 60-day extension as allowed by GDPR, although the actual answer came after that period. This information should have been provided from the beginning, upon data access. So transparency is key. Also through this work, we uncovered that well-studied targeting types, like interest targeting, were some of the least important to our participants. Instead, lesser-known types, like tailored audiences and lookalike targeting, were perceived as more concerning and thus warrant further study. As I mentioned earlier, advertisers uploaded and named lists of user identifiers for targeting, which is how we uncovered some potential Twitter policy violations. But without advertisers naming their list descriptively, we would never have known that there was a list of Christians that the advertiser wanted to exclude from their campaign. This raises more long-term questions about enforcing and maintaining transparency, given that advertisers can change list names or use other ways to hide how they're targeting users. And finally, we found that existing ad explanations should be much more detailed. As I mentioned before, we expected a highly detailed ad explanation to be perceived as creepy, but instead, we found this explanation was the most desirable. Participants wanted to know the full story about how they were targeted. Existing explanations are at the low end of the detail spectrum and could be much more helpful if they included more information. Thank you so much for listening.